Welcome to another responsive design video. This is part 2 in my series of videos exploring the grid layout. In the last video, we took a look at the basics of the grid layout. We saw a layout that looked like this right here, where we had a header, a nav, 2 columns, and a footer. If you didn't watch that previous video, you might look at that and go, yeah, we've been doing this for a while now. We use floats and clears and set their widths and margins and paddings and get them to column widths for the content boxes to all add up to 100%, and it's kind of a pain in the butt, but we do it because that's the way it's always been done. But in the last video, we kind of blew all that up, and we found that we could make this same kind of layout that we've been doing with a lot of little bits of math and a lot of extra markup and CSS, and we did it with just a couple lines of code. It looked kind of like this, where we had our content wrapper, and we applied grid template columns, and gave it 2 values, and then gave it a grid gap of 2%, and boom, we had our multi-column layout. What we're doing in this process of exploring grid is we're blowing up everything you've learned already about designing for the web. You might ask, well, why didn't you teach us this from the very beginning? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One, the way that you've learned how to do multi-column layouts up to this point is still kind of a standard in the industry. People are still using floats and clears and things like that. So you need to know how they work if you're going to jump in and start designing websites. 2, by exploring those other things, the old ways of doing it, you're learning a lot of the fundamentals of HTML and CSS along the way. Things that you should know in order to start understanding things like flex and grid. So those are kind of the reasons why you learned the old way of doing it. Now you're learning a new way of doing it, which is going to kind of blow up everything that you did in the past. So we're going to explore grid. Last video, we just looked at making the grid into 2 columns. What we know about designing for a grid is this. You need a grid container, and then you need grid elements or children, okay? These things will behave kind of like cells in a grid, where a grid container is going to be the box that the grid is going to be based on. All of these are going to be the cells in the grid. If you think about it like a checkerboard, these are all the squares in a checkerboard. All right, in order to do this video and work with this tutorial, you're going to need to set up your HTML. The HTML is going to be very simple. It's going to have inside the body a div called class grid-container. And then inside of grid-container, you're going to make a series of divs. And I made 9 of them. I think you should probably make 9 of them just to be consistent with me. And I called them div class and then named them 1 through 9. I spelled out the word 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And inside of each of those divs, I made a paragraph with some content in there. Okay? So take a look at mine. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then the closing of my grid container. So take a minute, pause the video, set up your HTML so you have what I have so that you can proceed. All right, welcome back. Now that we've got the HTML set up, let's take a look at the base for the CSS. For the CSS, I've got mine styled so that all of those cells are just going to have some basic default values of margin 0, some padding in them. I set a font size to be 2M. I set the font color to be white and the background color to be dark slate gray, just so that we can see what those cells look like. I set the margin and padding of the paragraphs to 0, and I set the grid containers styles to have a border of 2 pixels solid gray and a padding of 2%. The last thing I did is I just set up some style rules for 1 through 9 that I'm going to use in probably another video after this one. But this is the CSS. Take a minute, get your CSS set up so that it's kind of similar to mine, and you should have a web page that looks like that. Okay? where you've got all of your divs 1 through 9 inside of your grid container. So here's the CSS. Pause, get your CSS to look like mine, and then come on back. All right, welcome back. Now we're all on the same page. We've both got the HTML and the CSS, and we're ready to go to start making a grid. So grid container, as we saw, is the containing element for all of our grid items, all of the children. So this is the parent, these are the children. And as you know about grid, we need to apply the grid display to the grid container. So grid container is going to get display grid. If I save this and look at it in the browser, nothing's going to change because grid doesn't do anything to it all on its own. We have to then apply some rules. In the last video, you saw me use grid template columns. And grid template columns allowed us to set up a series of columns. So I'm going to set it up similar to what we did before. In the last video, you saw that we just did 2 different fractional units. In this one, I'm going to set up 3 fractional units. So let's go over to here. 1FR space, 1FR space, 1FR. I'm going to save it, double check. It says grid template columns. Good. I'm going to go look in the browser, and I've got 3 columns. And you might notice that it automatically put all of those things into rows as well. What it's going to do is it's going to look at all of the grid items, and it's going to align them into columns. And if you've got more items than the number of columns, for example, I've got 3 columns established, but I've got 9 items, it's going to start moving them automatically down to new rows. Okay? So let's look back here. Now I want to explain what these values in grid template columns are. So what these are going to do is set up what are called tracks. And a track is a space between 2 grid lines. So a grid is a series of lines with spaces in between. Think about like a tic-tac-toe board or a checkerboard or something like that, where you've got dividing lines in between squares in the checker or chessboard, and then you've got the actual squares themselves. On a checker or chessboard, the squares themselves would be these tracks. Okay? Those would be the cells on a checker or chessboard. And then the spaces in between those values and after those values would be the grid lines. So in a 3-track grid, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 lines that I'm going to be concerned with. In this video, I'm not going to be too concerned with those lines, but in future videos, we're going to start paying attention to those lines because we can set up our grid items to track across lines. We're not going to get into that in this video. We're just going to keep standard tracks and not worry about the lines. So what this is saying is 1 fractional unit for the size of this track, 1 fractional unit for the size of this track, and 1 fractional unit for the size of this track. So I've got 3 fractional units here, and I've got them broken up into 3 separate tracks. So what these fractional units do is they look at all of the space available. And for however many tracks you have, those are the total number of spaces we're working with. Now, these fractional units here would make up fractions. So I've got 1, 1, and 1. And if I add all those up, I get 3. And given that they're all set to 1, that means I've got 3 total. This one takes up 1 of the thirds, 2 of the thirds, 3 of the thirds. And that's how fractional units work. When I look at this, you can see they're even, the tracks are even widths because they all take up 1/3 of the overall space. I'm going to change one of these. I'm going to go 2. Now let's take a look at the total fraction here. I've got 1 plus 2 plus 1. So 1 plus 2 is 3, plus 1 is 4. So I've got 4 total in my fraction. This is taking up 1/4, 2/4, or a half, and 1/4. I'll save it, I'll check it in the browser. Now you can see that this center track is taking up a half of the overall space. The left track is taking up a quarter, the right track is taking up a quarter. What if I went to 3? Well, now it adds up to 5 total. So this is 3/5, 1/5, and 1/5. So the center should get wider. It got quite a bit wider, so you can see that this takes up 3/5 of the space, this is 1/5, and this is 1/5. So you kind of see how those fractional values are working. But what we're down to here is we've got 3 tracks. Let's see what happens when I put another track in there. I'm going to go 3, 1, or 1, 3, 1, 1. Well, there we go. I've got 4 tracks, and you can see what's going to happen is it will put those items into their 4 tracks. So I've got 9, so 4 in the first row, 4 in the second row, and then 1 in the third row. Okay? So that's how those columns work. You set up the total number of tracks you want, and then you set their sizes. Okay? So I'm going to go back to 1, 2, 1, because I think that's a good proportion. There we go. So it's 3 by 3. Now let's talk about grid template rows. Grid template rows allows you to set up the tracks for the rows. Right now you might say, well, the rows are already there. Yeah, they're already there, but they're just going to be their default sizes. I'm going to do a 1, 2, 1 with my rows now. 1 FR, 2 FR, 1 FR. And what I'm doing is I'm setting up the heights of these row tracks now. If these set up the widths of the column tracks, these are setting up the heights of the row tracks. And you can see that my middle one got taller. What if I went 4, 1, 4, 1? And it gets even bigger. Pretty neat, huh? We can also mix up. The power with this is that we can start mixing up these values. What if I knew that my header, which is going to be in track 1, always had to be a certain height? Maybe it always had to be 200 pixels. So I can start with going 200 px, and then 4fr, 1fr, and it set that first one up to be 200 pixels, the next one is 2fr, and the last one is a single fr. So you set an absolute value for the top, and then it's going to divide up the rest of the space that's left over in there according to its FRs, to its fractional units. Maybe I'll go 1fr and 1fr. And you can see that the second and third rows are a single fractional unit. They're both the same size, and this one is 200 pixels. I'm going to set the top to 100 pixels and do 3fr and 1fr. So it's 100 pixels for the top, 3 FRs for the middle, and 1 FR for the bottom. So this is how we're controlling the heights of those tracks. All right, so this is your grid template columns and grid template rows and how they work and how they divide up our grid into given number of tracks and sizes of tracks. The last thing I want to talk about is grid gap. And grid gap, if I just do, let's start with 2%. Grid gap is going to put gaps in between all of those grid items, right at the grid lines. I did 2% here, so you can see it's the 2% on the width is a little bit wider than the 2% on the height, because you know the width of this box is bigger than the height of this box. I could do percentage, I could do ems, M's are going to give me a more even gap. So if I did something like 0.5 M, it gives an even gap instead of the percentages. Or I could go with something like pixels. In this case, it's 15 pixels. Okay, so that's my grid gap. Now you've got the very basics of the grid layout down. We know how to establish a grid. We know how to set up the tracks for the rows and the columns to be the distribution of widths and heights that we want. And we've got grid gaps. In a future video, I'm going to start talking about how to make your grid items span across tracks and span from line to line. So I could turn this into a layout that would be like a multi-column with header, nav, and footer. All right, folks, thanks for watching, and tune in for future videos.